Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of Settling the Score, brought to you by the Alpha Zeta chapter of Kappa Kappa Psi. I'm Jackson McClellan. In this podcast, we'll guide you through a particular piece of wind ensemble music that you can hear live at the Indiana University Jacobs School of Music. Today, we're looking at Paul Hindemith's monumental piece, the Symphony in B-flat, which will be performed by our own IU Wind Ensemble on October 3rd, under the direction of Stephen W. Pratt. In part 1 of today's episode, you'll hear some background on the life of Paul Hindemith. In part 2, we'll break down the structure of the piece, explaining what specifically makes it so great. And finally, in part 3, we'll sit down with the conductor himself and get an insider look at the performance. Paul Hindemith isn't quite a household name, but among classical musicians and diehard music fans, he's a modern legend. Born November 16, 1895, in Frankfurt, Germany, Paul Hindemith had a highly musical childhood. At the insistence of his father, he studied violin and quickly became highly skilled on the instrument. Seeing promise in young Paul, his first violin teacher recommended that he study with Adolf Rebner, leader of the Frankfurt Opera and teacher at the Hoch Conservatory in Frankfurt. Rebner arranged for Hindemith to attend the conservatory tuition-free, where he studied both violin and composition. He was drafted into the German Imperial Army in 1917, playing bass drum in a military band throughout the First World War. Hindemith, according to his own recollection, survived grenade attacks only by good luck. Though fighting for the German Empire, Hindemith held no animosity towards the people he was fighting. In fact, while he was in the trenches of Alsace-Lorraine, Hindemith and his comrades passed the time by playing the music of the great French impressionist Claude Debussy. It was during a performance of Debussy's string quartet that Hindemith learned of Debussy's untimely death. As Hindemith recalled later in life, "Just after we had finished the slow movement, the signals officer burst in and reported in great consternation that the news of Debussy's death had just come through on the radio. We did not continue our performance. It was as if the spirit had been removed from our playing. But now we felt for the first time how much more music is than style, technique, and an expression of personal feeling. Here, music transcended all political barriers, national hatred, and the horrors of war." After the war, he returned to Frankfurt and began playing viola and violin professionally. He was highly active as a composer during this time and gained a significant amount of fame throughout the 1920s. In 1927, he moved to the German capital of Berlin and began working at the Berliner Hochschule, one of the most prestigious music schools in Germany. In the 1930s, the rapid rise of the Nazi Party complicated Hindemith's career, with some of his music being celebrated by the party as quintessentially German, and some being derided as experimental, so-called Jew music. As the party's grasp over German government strengthened, Hindemith, himself married to a Jewish woman, began to fear for their safety. He moved to Switzerland at the outbreak of the war, and then later to the United States. He would stay and work there until 1953. It was during his time in the United States that Hindemith began to fully appreciate the artistry of the American concert band. He began personal relationships with prominent bandmasters, most notably Keith Wilson, the director of bands at Yale University. Wilson's artistic conducting and arranging impressed Hindemith. The Yale bands may have influenced Hindemith's highly complex style in his Symphony in B-flat. In his later years, he returned to Europe, enjoying a fruitful career teaching, composing, and conducting. He died in Frankfurt, his home city, on December 28, 1963. As a composer, Hindemith is most notable for his wide variety in style. Most composers of the early 20th century fall into distinct national categories. The French Impressionists experimented with ethereal, dreamy sounds, while the German Romanticists stretched musical limits, all in an effort to express the most intense human emotions. In Vienna, Arnold Schoenberg and his students began abandoning tonal music altogether, using a mathematically driven system called 12-tone music. Meanwhile, American composers were experimenting with jazz and blues, blurring the lines between pop and classical music. Hindemith is unique in that he didn't subscribe to a single style. He was influenced by each of these traditions, incorporating them all into his mature work. Written in 1951 for the U.S. Army Band, the Symphony in B-flat is one of the most significant pieces of Hindemith's mature period. In the symphony, the subtle influences of Austrian atonality, German Romanticism, French Impressionism, and American jazz can all be heard at once. The piece is broken into 3 movements. Hindemith labels each with their respective tempos and styles. Movement 1, moderately fast with vigor. Movement 2, andantino grazioso, meaning at a walking pace but gracious. And 3, fugue, rather broad. Movement 1 begins with an intense impact. Woodwinds and percussion create a swirling, stormy texture, while the cornets play an aggressive, menacing melody. Instruments weave in and out of the music, but always against a steady stream of rapid notes. After an intense build-up, the dexter drops to low murmuring woodwinds. Reedy instruments like the oboe and tenor saxophone take over a more lighthearted melody, the second main theme of the piece. The tension builds until we get a dark and triumphant brass melody, marking the climax of the movement. The first movement closes with restatements of the earlier themes, building up to a final chord. While each movement of the piece is intensely dissonant, Hindemith chooses to end all 3 movements with a simple major tonic chord, making each movement feel satisfyingly closed. Movement 2 is in the form of the classical scherzo. In Italian, scherzo literally means joke, and is typically an opportunity for the composer to show a humorous, lighthearted, and inventive side. Hindemith begins the movement with a plodding, comical, and creepy march. Unusual for classical music, Hindemith features the saxophones as some of the main melodic instruments of the movement. Hindemith was a champion of the saxophone and wrote for it in many of his works. He is still, to this day, regarded as an important contributor to the saxophone repertoire. After his brooding march, Hindemith transitions into a lively and chaotic fast section, reminiscent of a jaunty country dance. The bells, tambourine, trombones, and woodwinds are all featured heavily, creating a shimmering and playful sound. Demonstrating the full scope of his compositional talent, Hindemith layers the slow march theme on top of the second, faster music. This shows the influence of early composers like Bach, Mozart, and Haydn, who prided themselves on careful construction and the ability to layer different melodies together. Hindemith begins the third and final movement with a syncopated, jazzy introduction. This leads into a fugue, which is a traditional German style. In a fugue, several short subjects are played many times over, the different repetitions overlapping and developing over time. In this movement, Hindemith utilizes the full spectrum of available sounds in the concert band, combining instruments in creative ways to create a constantly shifting fabric of music. The fugue movement uses two themes. When listening to the piece, keep your ears open for these two melodies. After a short interlude, Hindemith begins a stretto. The stretto is the most energetic section of the fugue, piling the themes on top of each other rapidly and building tension through dense, dissonant harmonies. Just before the end of the movement, Hindemith further elaborates the stretto, layering both fugue melodies together and adding the slow, stately melody from the beginning of the first movement. He weaves these three melodies together seamlessly until the music becomes extremely chaotic and intense. At the point of most tension, Hindemith begins a falling progression of chords, reminiscent of jazz from the middle of the 20th century. In a style similar to Beethoven, Brahms, Bruckner, and other great romantics, Hindemith closes the piece with a string of intense chords in the home key, B-flat major. I'm here with someone who knows this piece intimately and will be a central part of next week's performance. This is Director of Bands at Indiana University, Professor Stephen W. Pratt. Thanks for being with us.
Glad to be here.
So I think the first question I have about the Hindemith Symphony is, why did you select this piece?
The selection process for any concert is tricky because you try to do balance. At the same time, there are some pieces that call out to be played, that are worthy to be played, that should be played, and the Hindemith Symphony is certainly in that category as a general rule. But for me personally, this will be the third time I've approached it as a conductor. I've played it any number of times as an instrumentalist, and even before then, before I was good enough to play it, I listened to it and was familiar with it through recording and even some concerts. So it's been part of my life for a long time, particularly with the possibility of interpretation that the Hindemith Symphony brings. It's a challenge for the players, it's a challenge for the conductor, but it is also one that I think is very rewarding. So I wanted to make sure that this piece landed on one of the concerts this year so that I would have a chance to explore it again and to offer it again to the audience.
Absolutely. You mentioned all the style and the different nuances that you can get out of the piece. What do you think about when you are conducting this piece? Because it's very dry in some ways, like Webern, and it's very lush in other ways, much like Strauss or other romantic music.
Well, I think that the secret to the Hindemith Symphony, in some ways, both in listening to it and also performing it, is to approach it as a distinct piece of music that is part of the German tradition. And Hindemith, while he was composing in his own harmonic vocabulary, and he certainly had a 20th century understanding of rhythm and harmonic function, at the same time was the inheritor of the German Romantic tradition. And so part of the deal, I think, is to approach it melodically from the Romantic tradition side and harmonically to try to understand what he's doing in terms of the function of that. But the real issue is balance, because when you have an orchestral romantic work, you have the strings that provide a certain function, the brass provide a certain function, and the woodwinds do, in a certain kind of balance. And Hindemith took those ideas and put it into a work for a wind ensemble or a wind symphony, and utilized those same kinds of principles. So rhythmic figurations that are continuous in the woodwinds, which are very similar to his use of the strings in tremolo. And so it's really important, I think, for the ensemble to understand what it is that is foreground and what it is that is background, and to work on the balance in that way. At the same time, just a few minutes ago, actually, before we started this interview, I was listening to a Berlin Philharmonic broadcast of Bruckner and Hans Pfitzner, both of whom could be said to represent the great Germanic tradition. Pfitzner followed Bruckner and Hindemith followed Pfitzner, but in any event, they used long flowing melodies. And Hindemith in this symphony certainly does that. At the same time, he is the master of counterpoint, and the symphony is filled with brilliant touches of contrapuntal actions that mean something and mean a lot. And the audience may not necessarily hear everything that he is presenting, but it's done in such a model way of craftsmanship and creativity that I think that the audience does hear the effects and the colors and the juxtaposition of harmony against those wonderful melodic lines. And so that's what I think we have to have in order to make the Hindemith Symphony not just a run-through piece, but rather an interpretation of one that fits into the world of Paul Hindemith.
Well said. Now, one of the most striking features of this piece for me is, like you said, those long flowing melodies, which he often uses in juxtaposition. So he'll take the A theme and the B theme and play them right on top of each other with, as you said, just fantastic counterpoint. Does that present some unique challenges for the ensemble or for the conductor?
Well, I think actually more for the ensemble than for the conductor, in that it doesn't change the beat pattern for the conductor, but the players need to immediately recognize when they have melodic fragments that need to come out, or when others have similar melodic fragments to emulate or simulate the same style throughout. So that has been part of this rehearsal process, is for the various groups or individuals who have certain melodic fragments to play those in the same style as everyone else. And so that's part of that. But also when themes are presented as melody, counter melody, sometimes even a three-way thematic area, as to how to balance that. For instance, in the second movement, it starts off with a wonderful duet with trumpet and alto saxophone. And the players both need to be expressive, but they also need to be in balance, which generally means that the trumpet player plays a little bit less and the saxophonist plays a little bit more, so the audience hears them as individuals who are balanced in terms of the duet. So a lot of that belongs to the players with the advice and consent of the conductor in the rehearsal process.
Of course. Being an audience member listening to this piece, I know you said you have experienced it as an audience member, as a performer, and a conductor. When you're sitting in the audience, what do you listen for, and what do you think people should listen for when they come to the concert next week?
The opening movement starts off with a very dramatic, almost heroic theme. And I think immediately the audience can hear that as, okay, here we go. This is going to be an exciting start to this piece. And then as the movement goes along, individual melodies come through. The languorous quality of the third theme, the perky quality of the second theme. And so audiences listen in different ways, individuals do. Some people will hear emotions, bravura versus happy versus cheerful versus foreboding. Other people will listen on a more technical level. Trombonists will listen to their trombone colleagues or whatever.
Of course.
But I hope that the audience listens to the various moods that are presented, and when something is happy and cheerful, or spirited, or it sounds like a race is being run, that they catch the emotion of that, which I think adds a lot of meaning to this particular piece.
Mm-hmm. Also on this program, in addition to this enormous and emotionally complex piece, you've also got a very large-scale piece by Don Freund, and you have emblems by Aaron Copland. So filling out a program like that, I mean...
Absolutely. The beginning and the end. The beginning is Emblems by Aaron Copland. His masterwork for wind band. We play other pieces by Copland that either appeared in transcription in his own hand or by other people. But this is the piece that he did in his mature writing style for wind band that is exclusively for us. And it's a huge piece. When it came out in 1964, there were any number of people who felt that it was harmonically too advanced because they were hoping for Appalachian Spring or Billy the Kid. But at the same time, as time has gone by, we recognize more and more what a wonderful piece it is, written in his mature style, which utilizes a lot of wonderful themes and very exciting moments, but it represents the best of Copland in so many ways. So we're just very fortunate to have that. And so that blockbuster begins the program. And then in 1992, when Professor Don Freund arrived at IU and heard the wind ensemble, at that time conducted by Professor Kramer. He was thrilled by having the possibility of writing for that group, and wrote a very challenging concerto for wind band called Spinning Rounds. It's in two movements, and it utilizes every technical challenge, lots of different styles. It's a wonderful piece by Professor Freund. And so we're reprising that. I think this is his, would that be his 25th year on the faculty? And also he's celebrating sometime this year his 70th birthday. So we're pleased to present that. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the Hindemith Symphony from 1951, which was perhaps the most influential piece in terms of a major composer writing a very serious piece for wind band. And that opened up the world for others to be able to follow and write symphonically for us in longer pieces. And so this concert represents, I think, a very strong sense of architecture within the wind band repertoire. New piece, older pieces with great composers. And then we have a brand new piece that we're performing by Andrew Boss called A la Machaut, which is based on the composer of Renaissance era, medieval music brought to life in 2016, so that's wonderful. Mm-hmm. And a little bit of Granger and representation of the music of Eric Whitacre. So there are lots of other things to contrast, but those outside pieces are the huge ones.
Mm-hmm. That's something I always value about band concerts specifically, is there's always a diversity of era and a diversity of style. But it really is built on that core canon, like the Copland Emblems and the Hindemith Symphony in B-flat. What do you think the role of those canon pieces, those core masterworks, is for the modern wind band?
Well, a couple of things. If you go to an orchestra concert, not a pops concert, but a standard orchestra concert, you'll have more than likely an overture, and then a soloist, usually a pianist or a violinist, but sometimes someone else, intermission, and then a symphony, or something like that. But every once in a while, you'll have the opportunity to hear something brand new. And that is great for variety. Well, most of our repertoire would be considered in that category of brand new, since most of our repertoire is after 1950, but a lot of our repertoire is after 2000, which is fairly recent when you consider all of the repertoire that's there. So within that time period, let's say 1950 on, there are pieces that have developed to be more and more part of what we would call the canon. And it's necessary for us to repeat those pieces in order for them to remain in basic repertoire. If all we did was, there was a rule that said you can only play something that's less than 1 year old, we could do it, but we would not develop then the long range core repertoire that we want to have. So I think that the wind band area does a pretty good job of developing core repertoire and maintaining it. Things like emblems, things like the Hindemith Symphony, bringing pieces like Spinning Rounds by Don Freund, performing again and again to have a possibility of joining the canon, and then bringing in new pieces which could perhaps in 15 or 20 years be part of the basic repertoire or not. We know that during the time of Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach was not the most famous composer in the world, and there were other people who we've heard of and do not hear their music who would have been considered more famous. Who knows what the basic repertoire will look like for us in 100 years, but I have great hope that the Hindemith Symphony in B flat and Emblems by Aaron Copland will remain, as well as several other pieces on our program Tuesday night, will remain in the canon.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you today. I know I've learned a lot about the symphony in this time. I think we're all looking forward to the concert, which is Tuesday in the MAC, 8 p.m. Is that correct?
8 p.m., October 3rd, Tuesday night in the Musical Arts Center, yes.
All right, we can't wait. Thanks again.
Right. Thank you.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Settling the Score. Production by Becca Kroniak, Alex McGill, and myself, Jackson McClellan. Thanks to Kappa Kappa Psi, the Indiana University Department of Bands, and Mr. Stephen W. Pratt for all their help. The IU Wind Ensemble will be performing a terrific program, including the Hindemith Symphony, October 3rd at 8 p.m. in the Musical Arts Center. We can't wait for you to hear it.